he said.
I want to give you all an idea what Judaism was like in Jesus' day. In order to do that, I'm going to give you some of the history of Judaism, so bear with me while we go through this. If we start back in the monarchy, back in the Old Testament, Judaism was a temple-centric religion. The religion was focused on the worship of Yahweh in the temple in Jerusalem. They understood that's not actually where Yahweh lived. He said, heaven is my throne, earth is my footstool, but the temple was where they went. When the temple was destroyed in 587 BC and the Jews were taken into captivity in Babylon, they had to devise a form of their religion that did not rely on the temple and the sacrifices in the temple, since they weren't allowed to do that in Babylon. And what they chose was to study the Torah, the law of God. Of course, they had been taken captive into Babylon because they had ignored the law, so that's where they wanted to put their focus. And they built these meeting houses, public meeting houses, which came to be called synagogues, where they were taught and they discussed the law of God, centered on the teaching of leaders that they called rabbis. Now, rabbis were not priests of the house of Aaron. They were supposed to receive the same anointing that the elders had received when Moses appointed them at the urging of his father-in-law Jethro in Exodus 18. But they continued to develop their notion of how to obey the law and spent time doing what they called building a fence around the law. That is, they would develop ways of approaching the law such that you couldn't really violate the law even if you wanted to, because you never really got close enough to do it. When Zerubbabel brought people back from Babylon into Jerusalem to rebuild the Second Temple, that was around 537 BC, a number of Jews stayed in Babylon. It was actually a fairly small number that came back. And there were some others that came with Ezra and with Nehemiah, but still, most remained back in Babylon. And while they were building the temple and worshiping at the temple as before in Jerusalem, the study of the Torah along with the rabbis continued in Babylon. And then, as people do, Jews moved to other cities in the ancient world. And what began was what the Jews called the diaspora, which is the spreading of Judaism around the world. And most of that spreading consisted of this form of Judaism that we can call rabbinic Judaism, the Judaism of the rabbis. Now, around 165 BC, the Jews in Judea, who were under the dominion of a group called the Seleucids, who were descendants of some of Alexander the Great's generals, they rebelled against the king of the Seleucids, who was Antiochus IV, and succeeded in throwing off his rule and established a dynasty there in Judea called the Hasmonean dynasty. Interestingly, the Hasmoneans established not only themselves as kings, but also as priests in Jerusalem, so that the priests who were priests in Jerusalem in Jesus's day were not members of the house of Aaron, like the law said they were supposed to be. They were imposters. And there were some Jews in their setting who felt as though the priesthood had been corrupted. The folks who produced the Dead Sea Scrolls in the Qumran community are likely some of those people. Anyway, after the Jews established this independent Jewish state, there was an influx of Jews from around the world, and some of them came to Judea, but a number of them settled in Galilee. And the rabbis in Galilee became very important. They were reputed to be particularly strict in their interpretation of Torah, and it was maybe 500,000 Jews emigrated into the area during that period, so that Galilee became a center for rabbinic Judaism. Now, in the Judaism of Jesus' day, there was a split. There were the Jews who were temple-centered and focused on the worship of Yahweh through sacrifice in the temple. These were the Sadducees that you read about in the New Testament. And then there were the Jews who were developing what they called the oral law, which was the law around the Torah, and developing that form of Judaism. The Pharisees, who are named in the New Testament, were one party of the Torah-centered type of Jews. They weren't the only ones, but they were one of the parties that was influential. Now, in the 100 years after Jesus died, the Jews fought 3 separate wars of independence against the Romans, and they lost all 3. By the end of that, the temple had been dismantled, the Jews had been banned from living in Jerusalem, and so many rabbis had been killed in these wars that some of the leaders were afraid that the oral law would be forgotten. So a leader around 200 AD by the name of Yehuda HaNasi began writing down the oral law, and he wrote down 63 treatises organized by legal topic, and over the next 300 years people added to them, writing down what they knew of and remembered of the oral law. This group of 63, they called them tractates, was called the Mishnah. And then they also wrote down the opinions of, minority opinions of many rabbis about the Mishnah, and this was called Gemara. And the combination of these 2 books, Mishnah and Gemara, centered around the Torah portions that they're discussing, is called the Talmud. Now, there are actually 2 Talmuds in modern Judaism. One is called the Jerusalem Talmud, the other is called the Babylonian Talmud. The Jerusalem Talmud has a little bit older commentary by the rabbis, but it's not a complete commentary. The Babylonian Talmud is a little more recent, but it is complete and covers the whole thing. So Jerusalem and the Babylonian Talmud, they have the same law, the Torah, they have the same Mishnah, they have different Gemaras, okay? These days, if you hear somebody quoting the Talmud and they don't say which one it is, most likely it's the Babylonian Talmud. That's the default. Now, something to understand about the Talmud is, while it was written down from about 200 AD forward, the rabbis quoted in the Talmud, an awful lot of them were from earlier than that. So in fact, if we want to understand the Judaism of Jesus's day, we can go to the Talmud and find contemporaries of Jesus and Paul and what they were discussing. And a number of the things that they discussed show up in the New Testament. And not only that, but a large percentage of the rabbis quoted in the Talmud are actually from Galilee. So we're not just looking at contemporaries of Jesus, we're looking at the rabbis with whom he had discourse. Now, I'm going to cover this in another video, but in actual fact, if you want to know what is meant by the law in Paul's writings, he was talking about the Torah and then the oral law, which had been built as a fence around the Torah. The Old Testament was not the law in Paul's writing. Jews never referred to the Old Testament as the law. The only part of the Old Testament that was law was the first 5 books. Anyway, that's Judaism in Jesus's day. Hope you enjoyed the introduction. There will be other videos in the channel. Go look for them. If you'd like me to speak to your group, my website, philweingart.net, has my contact information along with some articles and sermons that I've done. Also, you can get my books on Amazon.com. The Rabbi on the Mount, How Jesus' Judaism Clarifies the Sermon on the Mount, and also He's Greater Than You Know, Essays for a Doubting Christian, both available in trade paperback and Kindle format. Hope to hear from you soon.
And suddenly we saw him.